of a brave new world, captains of industry, have visions grand and great designs, but none have room for me. They see a world where every's rich and smart and young, but if I live to see such things, too late for me they come.
In recent months, more than 1 million people, most of them young, have protested against a new economic order called globalization. This represents one of the greatest in the 60s. Surely never before has the human race enjoyed such amazing capacity to create wealth and reduce poverty. Yet never before has the gulf between rich and poor been so vast and inequality so widespread. The facts of globalization are revealing. A small group of powerful individuals are now of Africa. Just 200 giant corporations dominate a quarter of the world's economic activity. General Motors is now bigger than Denmark. Ford is bigger than South Africa. Unseen by shoppers in the high street, the famous brands of almost everything from running shoes to baby clothes are now made in very poor countries with cheap labor, at times bordering on a form of slave labor. Tiger Woods, the golfer, is paid more money to promote Nike than most of the entire workforce actually making Nike products here in Indonesia. Is this the global village we are told is our future? Or is it merely an old project that used to be run by the divine right of kings and is now run by the divine right of multinational corporations and by the financial institutions and governments that back them? This film is about these new rulers of the world, and especially their impact on one country, Indonesia. Indonesia is where the old imperialism meets the new. This is a country that should not be poor. It's rich in almost everything. Mountains of copper and gold, oil, timber, and the skills and labor of its people. Colonized by the Dutch in the 16th century, Indonesia was plundered by the West for hundreds of years, a debt that is yet to be paid back.
Ratusan tahun lamanya Indonesia itu dihisap oleh negara-negara utara. Bukan hanya Indonesia, semua negara-negara kulit berwarna. Sehingga Barat menjadi kuat, menjadi makmur, menguasai keuangan dan perdagangan sampai sekarang. Nah, sekarang didikte oleh IMF, oleh Bank Dunia. Negeri yang begini kaya diubah menjadi negara pengemis sekarang, Indonesia. Karena tidak adanya karakter pada elit.
Globalization is used by its champions to suggest a coming together of people of all races, of all countries, and it will relieve poverty, it will distribute wealth. What we're actually seeing is precisely the opposite processes in train, that the poor are becoming markedly poorer, while the very wealthy are becoming staggeringly wealthy.
And here are some of the staggeringly wealthy. This is a wedding in Jakarta of the Indonesian elite. Two merchant families are being united. 4 years ago, the World Bank called Indonesia a dynamic economic success, a model pupil of the global economy. Among the Versace dresses and diamonds are those who've reaped the benefits of the new global freedoms. Freedom to watch money make more money. In this respect, they could be any nationality. Outside this wedding, there's another world. In Indonesia, as many as 70 million people live in extreme poverty. We calculate that it would take an Indonesian worker like this waiter 400 years to pay for a wedding reception like this. Less than 5 miles away is the backyard of the global economy, the site of the dynamic success you don't see. This is a labour camp that's home to workers who make the clothes we buy in the high streets and shopping malls. This is the human price paid for our fashionable trainers, our smart shirts, our jeans with a tag that says, "Made in Indonesia." Young people living here who make the famous brands are paid on average the equivalent of 72 pence a day, about $1. That's the legal minimum wage in Indonesia. According to the Indonesian government, it's just over half a living wage. The dormitories are made from breeze blocks and packing cases. When it rains, they flood. There are open sewers and no clean running water. Many of the children are undernourished and prey to disease. While I was filming here, I caught dengue fever, carried by the mosquitoes which infest these slums. It kills children. The conditions here are not very different from workers' camps in other parts of Asia, in Africa and Latin America, where the famous brands are also made cheaply for lucrative Western markets. And this is where they work, in what is called an economic processing zone, which means a vast area of sweatshops. The factories may look modern, but once you step inside, you feel the claustrophobia of the workers, the sheer frenzy of their production, and you see their fatigue.
John Pilger.
Posing as fashion buyers, we film secretly in this factory. The factories are owned by Taiwanese and Korean contractors who employ cheap labor to make the products of famous brands such as Nike, Reebok and Adidas. We looked at one famous brand, Gap. The working conditions we found are by no means the worst.
So you do Gap, of course. You do lots of Gap. And I mean the quality control of Gap, I think, is excellent.
In the future, we are trying...
We found more than 1,000 mostly young women working crowded together under the glare of strip lighting in temperatures that can reach 40 degrees centigrade. The only air conditioning is upstairs where the bosses are. Working hours can vary and can be increased dramatically when an urgent export order has to be met. We surveyed 5 factories regarded as typical, and I interviewed workers from all over Jakarta.
You work a 24-hour shift with just a couple of breaks, and then 2 hours later you start another shift. So in effect you work a 36-hour shift.
Saya kerja long shift tuh dari jam 7.30 sampai pagi lagi 7.30, pas terakhirnya sore jam 18.30.
Are you given any choice?
Nggak bisa.
What would happen if you refused to do this 24-hour shift?
Ya mungkin ada hukuman, tapi belum pernah menolak sih. Jadi takut aja.
On these long 24-hour shifts, do you recall what labels you were packing?
Kebanyakan Gap sama Olevi.
Do any of the people from the Gap company ever visit your factory?
Sering.
Do they ever ask you about or investigate the working conditions, your working conditions?
Dulu pernah ada, tapi di personal itu anaknya tuh udah dikontak duluan gitu, udah nggak boleh ngomong yang salah gitu, harus sesuai omongan dari personalia.
What did they tell you to say?
Ya misalkan nggak bilang lembur longsip, terus pokoknya tidak boleh membuka rahasia perusahaan, tidak boleh menjelek-jelekan perusahaan.
This is what the Gap company calls a code of conduct. In response to criticism, famous global brands like Gap have come up with these codes. They say the idea is to set standards and protect workers, but how effectively is it enforced?
You have to come to Indonesia to really realize what codes of conduct means, and that it is almost useless to exercise or to implement code of conduct here in this country, because this government is always campaigning cheap labor here in Indonesia to attract the foreign investment, and codes of conduct cannot do anything about that. And because Indonesian workers is already very poor, and the rate of unemployment here is very, very high, so that people will work whatever kind of work they have, or how much they paid, they will still work.
The Gap company stipulates a maximum working week of 60 hours. It says workers may refuse overtime without any threat of penalty.
Are there people who do extraordinary shifts, like much more than 12 hours, even up to 24 hours?
Ada, kemarin QC juga ya finishing itu dari jam 8 sampai jam 12 malam. Dari jam 12 malam karena dengan alasan ini mesti diekspor. Kondisi mereka berdiri dari jam 8 sampai jam 12 itu berdiri, nggak ada duduk. Ini ekspor harus selesai, targetannya tanggal sekian, mesti.
Is the Gap Code of Conduct displayed in the factory?
Pasang sama sekali, bahkan peraturan perusahaan pun tidak ada yang dipasang di tingkatan pabrik.
Nggak ada. Nggak usah kode etik. Peraturan di dalam perusahaan itu nggak pernah dilihatin dengan kami, apalagi kode etik dari suatu barang.
These boxer shorts were made in one of the factories we investigated. Before we left London, we bought a pair at a Gap store in Oxford Street for £8. Out of that £8, an Indonesian worker gets less than 4 pence. It's the same for running shoes that sell for £100. Out of that £100, a worker gets around 40 pence. That wouldn't even buy the laces.
Ya kami kaget, benar-benar ya. Oh, ternyata kami dalam satu celana ini kami bisa menguntungkan pengusaha begitu banyak, apalagi ribuan celana. Sehari minimal kami harus menghasilkan 3.000 celana. Itu minimal.
Last year, the chief executive of Gap earned more than $5.5 million. The profits of Gap were $1.38 billion. And this is typical of many multinational companies. In order to protect the workers in this film, we have not named the factories we investigated. In Indonesia, as in other countries which have sweatshop economies, workers who speak out face the danger of victimization from contractors and violence from anti-trade union forces. Dita Sari, a trade union leader, was herself imprisoned and tortured.
Codes of conduct must be monitored by trade unions. How could you monitor codes of conduct if trade unions is still weak, if the police is surrounding their activists, and if they're facing repression whenever they operate?
We asked the Gap company for an interview, but they declined, saying it was unfair not to identify the factories as they couldn't verify our evidence. We sent them a list of questions, and they supplied this statement. Gap says it employs one of the most comprehensive factory monitoring programs in their industry. For some manufacturers, our standards are too tough, and we refuse to do business with them. We prefer to work with them to fix the problem. We can't force them to comply.
One of the things that we can do to take action in support of better conditions for people in developing countries is when we buy anything, ask the retailer where this product comes from. under what conditions it's produced, write to the company that made the product and say you want assurances that this comes from a factory that treats its workers well, that gives its workers rights to be able to form trade unions, etc. And these are some very basic ways in which we can act as informed consumers.
I'm not afraid to bend my back. I'm not afraid of dirt, but how I fear for lack of honest work.
Globalization in Asia has a secret history. The great sweatshops and banks and luxury hotels in Indonesia were built on the mass murder of as many as 1 million people, an episode the West would prefer to forget. But many people here have not forgotten. In recent years, people all over the country have begun searching for the remains of loved ones murdered when General Suharto seized power in the mid-1960s, aided by the United States and Britain. Until recently, the truth of this episode has remained so secret that this is the only known photograph of the atrocities.
One day in early October 1965, a gang of thugs entered this school in Jakarta and beat to death the headmaster. He was suspected of being a communist. His murder was typical of the slaughter of more than 1 million people, teachers, students, civil servants, peasant farmers. Described by the CIA as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century, the origins of this terrible episode have been covered in mystery. Certainly it brought to power General Suharto. But what is now emerging is the extent to which he was secretly backed by the United States and Britain and by Western business leaders. Within a year of the bloodbath, Indonesia's economy was effectively redesigned in America, giving the West access to vast mineral wealth, markets and cheap labor, what President Nixon called the greatest prize in Asia.
Western business, the great value of General Suharto was that he succeeded in getting rid of the founder of modern Indonesia, Ahmed Sukarno, a nationalist who believed in economic independence for his people. He kept the great Western corporations out of Indonesia and threw out their agents, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It was only when one of his generals, Suharto, seized power that the door was open to Asia's greatest prize.
When the Suharto regime came in after the putsch, they were able to make a lot of the fact that they were calling the IMF and the World Bank back in. They were going to rescue them, you see, and British propaganda in particular made a lot of this. You know, the IMF was decent, and it was going to bring order, and everything was going to be lovely in the Indonesian garden. And as I say, a British diplomat still alive has said to me that was very much a part of the deal.
Britain and the United States secretly conspired to back General Suharto. The American ambassador assured him that the US government is generally sympathetic with and admiring of what the army is doing. Thousands were rounded up. What was not known at the time was later revealed by American officials. The CIA had supplied a list of 5,000 opponents to be assassinated, and embassy officials ticked off their names as they were murdered. The British ambassador recommended a little shooting as an essential preliminary to effective change.
In the first few days, the British sources in particular purported not really to know what was going on. course they knew what was happening. I mean, there were bodies being washed up on the lawn of the British consulate in Surabaya. There were bodies floating all over the Malacca Strait and so forth. A man called Hadi Broto, a lieutenant colonel or something, was anxious to take some troops, Indonesian troops, from the east coast of Sumatra, from the northeast coast of Sumatra, to east and central Java, so that they could take part in what we now know was this terrible Holocaust, really. He found a Panamanian ship, and the ship sailed with the troops down the Malacca Strait, escorted by 2 British warships.
So the British were directly involved in, as what you describe as a Holocaust?
Well, I would count that some sort of involvement, wouldn't you?
The American press reported these events not as a crime against humanity, but in terms of their economic advantage to the West. Time magazine called them vengeance with a smile, and the West's best news for years. Others described a gleam of light in Asia. The seeds of globalization were planted in the bloodbath. In 1967, the Time Life Corporation sponsored a conference in Switzerland that planned the corporate takeover of Indonesia. It was attended by the most powerful businessmen in the world, such as David Rockefeller. The giants of Western capitalism were represented: the oil companies, the banks, General Motors, British Leyland, ICI, British American Tobacco, Lehman Brothers, American Express, Siemens. Across the table were Indonesian leaders approved by General Suharto. For Western business, it was the start of the gold rush, which later became known as globalization. No one mentioned the killing of 1 million people.
I've never, ever heard of a situation like this for any country, where global capital essentially holds a meeting with state and hammers out the conditions of their own entry into the country. The conference went on for 3 days. The first day was when the Indonesians spoke and essentially made their case. They divided into 5 different sections on the second day. Sectoral meetings, mining in one room, food services, light industry in another, banking and finance in another. Chase Manhattan was there. And simultaneously, they hammered out policies that were going to be acceptable to these global investors on a sector-by-sector basis, with each of the people going around the table saying, this is what we need to see, this. And they basically designed the legal infrastructure for investment in Indonesia.
Was the foreign business community here aware that they were dealing not just with a corrupt, nepotistic dictatorship, but also with a mass murderer?
That's a very general question.
Well, no, it's quite specific, actually. I mean, mass murder is mass murder.
The fact that many people have died in Indonesia in unfortunate, tragic circumstances at the directly or indirectly as a result of the previous regime is hugely unfortunate. Whether if foreign investment had not been here, that would have prevented in any way those events occurring. Nobody has perfect vision on what might have been.
Globalization began in Britain in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher dismantled much of manufacturing and poured millions of pounds into building up the arms industry. Indonesia became an important British arms market, and General Suharto was sold everything lethal, from fighter aircraft and missiles to warships and machine guns. Unknown to the British public, millions of pounds went to the dictator in export credits. In other words, a large part of his arms bill was paid by the British taxpayer. So important was Suharto as a business partner that the mass murderer was welcomed to London by the Queen. Who are the new rulers of the world? Their empire today is greater than the British Empire ever was. This is the centre of this new empire, all within a square mile in Washington. Down the road from the White House and the US Treasury is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These two bodies are the agents of the richest countries on earth, especially the United States. The World Bank and the IMF were set up near the end of World War II to rebuild the economies of Europe. Later they began offering loans to poor countries, but only if they privatized their economies and allowed Western corporations free access to their raw materials and markets.
Debt has really been used as an instrument in order for the IMF and the World Bank to get their policies implemented in many developing countries. And we're into a situation now where the poorest countries are in a cycle, a vicious cycle of poverty. They can't get out. And the kind of debt cancellation that's been given still will not allow them to get out of this poverty trap. It's not a question of debt forgiveness, because actually many of the debts were incurred under pressure from the international institutions or were given in collusion with governments which weren't acting in the interests of their people.